Hello and welcome to Talking Point. So my name is Victoria Manning. I'm a professor in addictions at Monash University and head of research and workforce development here at Turning Point. I'm delighted to be chairing today's session titled Neuroplastic Wrap, the non-pathologising ecological alternative to diagnostic labels, presented by Dr Haley Peckham from the UK. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the various lands on which we meet. I'm currently on Wurundjeri country, and I pay my respect to the elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people listening today or in the future. We also recognise and value the knowledge and wisdom of people with a lived experience of addiction, their families and supporters. We celebrate the strengths and resilience they face and in the challenges of overcoming addictions and recovery, and value their important role in the development and delivery of health and community services. So today's presenter is Dr Haley Peckham. Her background includes philosophy, mental health nursing, psychotherapy and neuroscience, and her perspective is grounded in a colourful lived experience of recovering from complex trauma. While studying philosophy, Haley worked with children and adolescents in care, and realising that as adults they were overrepresented in the criminal justice system and mental health services, set out to understand the relationship between early experiences of brains, minds and behaviour. Whilst working as a mental health nurse, Haley studied molecular neuroscience at Bristol and gained her PhD from the University of Melbourne, where she learned about the neuroscience of how experiences shape our brains and the evolutionary biology that illuminates why experiences may shape us the way they do. These insights are critically important for clinical practice, especially for the delivery of coherent, ACE-aware and trauma-informed approaches. And Haley seeks to share them with interested professionals in Australia and in the UK. So we're really lucky to have her here today. So please welcome Haley.
Thank you, Vic. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm glad that we're here. So my name's Dr Haley Peckham. Thank you for the introduction. So look, just to really contextualize what I'm bringing today, this work really started when I was 12 years old. I do realise that sounds like an exaggeration, but here, bear with me. So I grew up in a family, and one of my parents had a mental illness. They were actually quite cruel to me in that time. And the narrative that sort of evolved out of that was that they couldn't help it because they were ill. And so I didn't really have any redress or recourse. I didn't really know what to do with any of that. And I remember feeling, very angry and upset. And at 12 years old thinking, no matter what, I don't want to use the idea of illness as an excuse. Now, I was 12 and I was cross at that time. But then, of course, things went quite difficult for me, and I was self-harming and ultimately became very, very, very low and was suicidal on and off for a long time. And I avoided psychiatrists. I didn't want to go anywhere near them. I didn't want a diagnosis. I didn't want medication. I didn't think that was going to help me. So what I did was eventually I went to my GP and I got a referral to my local psychotherapist. He was an NHS psychotherapist. Very lucky. I was very, very lucky. And that experience profoundly changed the trajectory I was on. And then I was like, well, how did that work then? So I had these experiences as a kid that took me into this place of self-harming. And then I had these experiences in psychotherapy, which sort of mitigated it, ameliorated the effects of those early experiences. So I was like, I want to understand about that. So that's when I went back and I did my master's at Bristol, and I did my PhD here at the University of Melbourne. So this is 40 years in the growing. I'm 51 now. So look, this is what I want to share with you. The Neuroplastic Narrative, a non-pathologizing but still biological foundation for trauma-informed and adverse childhood experience-aware approach. So, that's all. There we go, got it. All right. So there's three main points that I'm going to be talking about today. This is the kind of really, really tight summary. Experiences shape brains, relational experiences shape brains, and experiences calibrate our life history strategy. Now, there's no need for you to know what I'm talking about just yet because I haven't explained what that is, but we will get there. All right. So I used to work in this building. I used to work at spectrum. I was there for a year. It was a happy time. I enjoyed being here. It was a rich time for me. But I used to walk past the sign that said this every day. Research is to see what everyone else has seen and to think what nobody else has thought. Now, really in the neuroplastic narrative, I've just brought together a few things in a way that the way that I've brought them together, I think, is novel, but none of these are particularly discoveries that I've made. I've just put them together in this way. But what I'm hoping is that it brings a new lens. And by doing that, it'll invite new research questions. It's a new way of framing the things that we've made sense of really through the medical model. So it's an opportunity, I think. So essentially, the neuroplastic narrative is an ecological and rather than a pathological framework. It privileges lived experiences and it addresses and answers two questions. How do we adapt to experiences? And why, ultimately, we adapt to what end. And it'll help if, throughout the talk, you bear in mind that I'm thinking over two timescales. And the first is an evolutionary timescale. So the things that we evolve have evolved over many, many lifetimes. So that's a very long, very large timescale. But there's the timescale of our personal life, the lived experiences that we have in our early development. So these mechanisms that we've evolved over many lifetimes help us to adapt to our ecological niche within our lifetime. And by ecological niche, I also mean our relational ecological niche. You'll hear about that. And lastly, I'd say the way that it helps me to make sense of the brain is to think about it as being the organ of anticipation. So we learn from our past experiences and past threats and opportunities. And we do that so that we can anticipate threats and opportunities in the future. Nature kind of assumes that we're going to be in the same environment. So we orientate from the past to anticipate the future. So it's sort of this idea of being forewarned is forearmed. We're able to be more ready for the threats and we're able to make better use of the opportunities. So in moving away from the pathological to the ecological, I'm taking an adaptive perspective. So the first thing that I'll do is talk through some neuroplastic mechanisms. There are 4 that I will very briefly go through. And then I'll talk about how our relational experiences also shape our brains. And I'll dive a little bit into attachment theory, but not deeply, I don't have time. But this adaptive perspective really throws up a problem, and it really stumped me for a little while. And then I managed to make some sense of it. So I'll introduce you firstly to the problem and then to the evolutionary perspective, which helps us reconcile it. What we need to bear in mind, of course, is that evolution shapes us for survival and reproduction, sadly not for happiness, health, or longevity, or anything pro-social, except where it serves the needs of evolution, which is about survival, and specifically survival in the service of reproduction. Post-reproduction, evolution is not so bothered. So the way that I like to talk about neuroplasticity, you often hear about it when you talk about injury and stroke and those sorts of things, but really it's just the natural phenomena of the brain and neural nets or neural networks. So think of experiences as being a little bit like raindrops. So you don't expect raindrops, each raindrop doesn't make a significant difference, and neither really does each experience, but en masse, they really do. And so imagine if I'm a newborn baby and I hear footsteps and then I hear the sound of someone's voice. And then shortly after, I feel hands on me and I'm held. And then I can smell my mum and then perhaps she'll feed me and then I can taste her as well. And all of these experiences over and over falling like rain, they become associated into this idea of that mother. And so then we can come to anticipate mother, anticipate what she'll feel like and smell like and so on. So these raindrops are quite little, if you like. The exception to that is if you have an experience that fills you with fear, terror, real terror that you might lose your life, in which case you've got a very large raindrop, 2 liters or more, maybe. So these experiences, like rain, fall on the surface of the land or on the brain. And as they do so, they travel down the path of least resistance. And when it's experiences, they'll create neural pathways and they'll travel down those neural pathways, just like water. And as they do, that flow then wears a groove. So that the next time it rains, the next time there are new experiences, they're likely to go down the pathways or the grooves or that are already there. And we know that rain ultimately shapes the whole of our geographical landscape. And similarly too with the brain. the experiences fall on our brain and they shape, I would say even build the brain. So we've got 86 billion neurons, each of which can make about 15,000 connections. And in the first 2 years of life, they estimate that we make something like 40,000 synapses a second for the first 2 years. So this awesome number of synapses. So every single experience is networking up our brain. And then we have synaptic pruning. That's the biggest time that we have pruning. And what gets pruned away are the weakest synapses and the least used pathways. So imagine what you're left with is a brain that is made of the experiences that have been most often repeated for you. And just take a second to think how dramatically different those brains are going to be between different families in particular. So that's sort of neuroplasticity with this rain and water metaphor. So this is an image that I've taken from the paper, which I'll sort of add to as we go through the talk today. We're starting right in the middle with the neuroplastic mechanisms, epigenetics, neurogenesis, and synaptic and white matter plasticity. And these are what we call proximate explanations. They're mechanistic explanations of how it is that experiences embed in our physiology and in our brains. So starting with the first mechanism, it's epigenetics. So epigenetics doesn't change the underlying genes that are held on the DNA, but what it does do is it adds tiny groups to the genes or to the histone core that the DNA wraps around, and there are other mechanisms too. There's an awesome number of mechanisms, really. But anyway, for the purposes of today, we'll just think about the epigenetic marks that are on the genes or the histone core that the DNA wraps around. And what they do is they make the genes more or less accessible for transcription. So it's a little bit like turning the volume of a gene up or turning it down. And this might make a difference if we've got a gene that's, say, involved in neuroplasticity and helping us learn. So one of the ways that we know epigenetics calibrates a stress response is in rodents. The glucocorticoid receptor, which is the receptor for corticosterone, which is similar to cortisol, but in rodents, this glucocorticoid receptor gene is epigenetically regulated by maternal care. So imagine I'm a rat mum, and I'm in a safe environment, and I've got all of the resources I need, and I've got all my little rat pups. Because I'm quite safe, because I've got all the resources, the time that I have can be spent licking and grooming my little rat pups. So that's what I spend my time doing. And so these rat pups, they get a permissive mark on their glucocorticoid receptor gene, which means that glucocorticoid receptor gene is more frequently transcribed and more frequently turned into protein, ultimately leading to these rat pups having a lot of glucocorticoid receptors, many glucocorticoid receptors. But imagine I'm a rat mum that isn't in a safe environment. I might be quite distracted by the environment being, say, a bit dangerous, or I might not have enough nesting materials. So my attention is disrupted by these things that also demand it. So what that means is the rat pups are going to get a little bit less licking and grooming. What that means is then ultimately there's fewer glucocorticoid receptors. So which rat pup from that data so far would you rather be, do you think? The first one, yeah. But that's usually what people say. But it's not that it's one is desirable and the other is less desirable, but both are adaptive. And the reason they're adaptive is because mum's caregiving, the licking and grooming, acts like a proxy for the level of danger in the environment. So over here, we have this stress response when the corticosterone is circulates around lots of glucocorticoid receptors that take it up. And as they take it up, the negative feedback means that stress response switches off very effectively. Over here, the corticosterone circulates for longer because there's fewer receptors. And that's probably useful because, of course, a stress response helps keep us alert, keeps us vigilant, keeps us awake, and it helps us learn, all of which might support our survival in the environment. So you can see that they're both adaptive and they're calibrated by the experiences that we've actually had in the environment. So the second mechanism to talk about is neurogenesis. So neurogenesis is the birth of and then the integration of new neurons into the existing network. And it's thought to underlie processes of laying down new memories or altering old memories, sort of updating them, if you like, subtle changes. And the way that I like to introduce this one is with this little guy who's a black-capped chickadee, and he is a food hoarding bird. Now, black-capped chickadees held in captivity have a higher rate of neurogenesis in the autumn than any other time of the year. Now, think about it. Well, autumn, of course, is when they're hiding their food in preparation for the winter. And so you'd expect that sort of makes sense. But if you compare the rate of neurogenesis with the birds in captivity with ones that are in the environment, you find the ones that are in the environment that are reliant on knowing where they've stored their food over the winter, they have a higher rate of neurogenesis. And if you compare those birds with birds that are in a harsh environment where food is scarce, so they are even more heavily reliant on remembering where their food is, their rate of neurogenesis is higher still. So what we're seeing is that potentially that the bird's experience of looking for food in their environment is calibrating their rate of neurogenesis accordingly. Next up, we have synaptic plasticity. So that's the neurons that fire together, wire together, which everyone's heard. But in London, taxi drivers have to learn the location of 25,000 streets within a 6-mile radius of Charing Cross. And if you watch them doing that learning, they kind of point and they mutter and they move around and it's not entirely clear what's happening. And if you're a mental health professional, of course, you might come to quite a different conclusion about what's going on. But what they are doing is learning about these 25,000 streets. The taxi drivers that do take on board this knowledge have increased grey matter volume in their hippocampus. And the authors say about that, it seems that there is a capacity for local plastic change in the structure of the healthy adult human brain in response to environmental demands. So this is a good thing that we're seeing, that we can learn, and that it makes a difference to our brains. And now moving on to white matter plasticity, this beautiful image is of myelinated pathways in the brain. So just going back to that water metaphor, if we're trying to move water from one place to the other, the most efficient way of doing it, of course, is to build a pipe. And that's pretty much what myelin does, if you like, in the brain. So I'm sure there's cords around here. Oh no, you're all very tiny. Here we go, there's some cords here. Oh, I can't lift them up high enough. But the cords that we get, they've got the copper wire and they've got the rubber around the outside. And what happens there is, of course, it makes the passage of the electricity faster and more efficient because it's not leaking out anywhere. Well, it's a very similar principle with myelin. So down most used neural pathways, you get activity-dependent myelination. And so it builds up myelin, so the signal is strong and it's not lost. It makes things faster and more automatic. So if we can also image myelination and white matter in the brain, which is excellent. So if we were to image the brains of pianists and compare them with the brains of normal people, I'm intentionally using that phrase, then we would see a difference. And the difference would be that the pianists have more white matter in their motor cortex, specifically, of course, because they've been spending so many hours practicing and rehearsing that their fine motor movements that they can play automatically. So that's built up all of that myelination in that area. And the reason I said normal people is because there are a lot of studies that show we image the brains of people with, whatever diagnosis it is, mental illness diagnosis that it is, and we compared them with the brains of normal people, and we found a difference in the structure of the brain. So that proves that it's a real pathology. But that's not a safe conclusion if we also understand that our experiences shape our brains, unless we've taken that into consideration. So there's a guy called Martin Teicher in Boston who does lots of fine-grained analysis of people's brains when they've experienced all kinds of traumas, even to the extent that he can see a difference in the signature of the brain. I think I couldn't tell you right off the top of my head if it's white matter or grey matter. I think white. But what he can see is a difference between people who've witnessed family violence visually and people who've witnessed family violence kind of orally through their ears. So even that fine-grained difference leads to a change in the brain. And it's not just piano playing. 2 weeks of meditation leads to changes in the brain. So does learning to juggle. So does learning to read. So does learning to drive. So does learning a second language. If I got you all to stand on one leg and whistle a folk song every day for 2 weeks, you'd probably see that there too. Wouldn't be particularly useful, but that's what I'm saying. You just do it over and over again, and it makes a difference. So that's something to bear in mind, right? Just be careful what you practice. Okay. So now moving out a little, we're heading into an ultimate explanation, and ultimate explanations are why explanations. So why do things work in the way that we do? And so I put attachment theory in because attachment theory is actually an evolutionary explanation. So attachment is exhibited by mammals, and it's an evolved strategy to gain the protection of a caregiver through seeking proximity to that caregiver. So that's the way in which it's survival positive and it's been selected for. And in humans, secure and insecure patterns are survival positive because the patterns are about finding a reliable way to get proximity to the caregiver so that you get the protection you need. The time that attachment falls down is when we become disorganized around attachment. The pet peeve of mine, I don't like the phrase disorganized pattern because it's a contradiction in terms. So we become disorganized when our evolutionary imperative to get proximity meets a contradiction of our lived experience, which says, actually, I feel under threat when I'm close to my caregiver. And so you enter into a space of paradox, which can't be resolved because there's no safety anywhere. I'm not safe without you, and I'm not safe with you. So that's unresolvable and throws up all sorts of problems. So where we're at the moment, I hope that I've brought you with me to sort of this interim conclusion that neuroplastic mechanisms turn our lived experiences, including our relational experiences, into biological adaptations that help us to adapt to the ecological and relational niche that we're in, and ultimately to survive and reproduce within it. But how do we then reconcile this with the adverse childhood experience study, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with? So they sent out about 17,000 questionnaires. They got almost 10,000 back. And what they were asking about was how many categories of adversity have you been through? And they were matching that up with the number of risk factors for diseases, which were the leading causes of death. So those are the original categories. They weren't looking for how much or how long or how bad, just the number of categories. What they found was that more than half of the respondents had encountered adversity. 1 in 8 had more than 4 adverse childhood experiences, which doubled their risks of heart attacks, cancer, stroke, or lung disease, increased their chances of getting sexually transmitted diseases 2.5 times, trebled the risk of having more than 50 sexual partners, quadrupled the risk for depression, increased by 5 to 10 times their risk of using drugs, injecting drugs, or becoming an alcoholic, and increased their risk of dying by suicide 12 times. And in a separate short study done shortly after, 6 out of a possible 8 categories of adverse childhood experiences reduced life expectancy by almost 20 years. They found a dose-response relationship between the number of categories of adversity and the number of risk factors for the leading causes of death. So how do we make sense of this? I've been saying all the time that experiences shape us in ways that help us to survive, to adapt, to reproduce. So how do we then make sense of this particular category or set of experiences that really seems to make us sick and shorten our lives? The sense that the authors made of this in this very well-known pyramid is that adverse childhood experiences lead to social, emotional, and cognitive impairments. So just to draw your attention to the way that they made sense of it is through this pathologizing frame. But evolutionary biologists have other ideas. So this chap, Stephen Hertler and the team there, they published this paper in 2022. And I was gutted when it came out because I thought, I wanted to write that one. But to be honest, they made an utterly fabulous job of it. It's a very in-depth, incredibly rigorous and rich paper. But their suggestion was that adversity in childhood is data. It's a sample of the environment that you're going to have to survive in and reproduce in. So getting an early heads up with a sample from childhood might be a good idea. And he said, perhaps that they are environmental stimuli upon which a child imprints during a sensitive period, such that they are strategically prepared to function during adulthood in similarly unstable and risky environments. But to think about this, we really need to think about what evolution's about. So evolution is, of course, a non-sentient process of attrition, that kind of falling away of those that are least able to survive and reproduce, that leaves those that are more able to survive and reproduce here to do so. And sort of in more ordinary terms, evolution really only cares that you survive long enough to pass your genes on to the next generation. And if after that you get sick or you die early, that's not really a problem for evolution. It still thinks you're a success and thanks you for your reproductive efforts. So Hertler then has conceptualized adverse childhood experiences as data from which this biological prediction about the future environment can be made. And then what he's done is reframed the adverse childhood experience study through the lens of life history theory. So we need to know what life history theory is. So life history theory, you can see, is the outside ring of this diagram that I'm sort of bringing to your attention. And just to sort of show you that on the left-hand side, you can see that the typical experiences in the environment here are benevolent and predictable, regulating and validating, and provide someone with a sense of, provide a child really with a sense of gaining agency and control. And this side associates with secure attachment and also associates with a slow life history. And then over the other side, on the right, if what we get in the environment is typically harsh and unpredictable, dysregulating and shaming, and brings about a sort of sense of lack of agency and control, then that's sort of that disorganized end of that scale of attachment. And it associates with fast life history. So let me ask you guys, what are rabbits famous for? They absolutely are. Breed like rabbits is the phrase. So rabbits, of course, they live in they're not really agents in their environment. They live in a very uncertain environment. Life of the rabbit is quite tense. You never know quite how long you're going to last. If something's going to shoot you, eat you, if a bird's going to come out of the sky, or you're going to get run over. They respond to this by maximizing the reproductive success. So I'm just going to read you this. Come out nicely here. Rabbits are weaned by 6 weeks. They're ready to reproduce by 21 weeks. They mate indiscriminately and frequently, gestate for 1 month and give birth to up to 12 kits, and may become pregnant again within a week. There are many, many more baby rabbits than there are adult rabbits. And so in this way, rabbits exemplify a fast life strategy. And that's in contrast to elephants. And what are elephants famous for? Elephants never forget, absolutely. And so memory, we think of memory as being about the past, but I really think the service of memory is about anticipation, as I said right at the start. The brain is the organ of anticipation. If we have a long memory, that's because we might be wanting to live a very long time, so we've got really good anticipation. And so elephants, of course, are they're masters of their environment. They're not kind of dominant predators or anything, but they're masters of their environment. They know where they want to be in it. They can construct the environment in the way that they want. They very often have only one calf. Sometimes they have 2. That calf suckles for about 3 years, spends about 8 years in very close proximity to the mother and allo mothers, is very much socialized by the herd. They're not ready to reproduce until they're 14, and then they go on and they live a very long time. So with elephants, they're really, the resources of the herd are really poured into these young. There's an assumption that the young elephants are going to live, and they're grieved if they don't. So the strategy for elephants is that they are, whereas the rabbits are sort of playing more of a numbers game because they're uncertain in their environment, they don't know, whether they're going to survive. What the elephants are doing is trying to make their young very competitive in the environment for the available resources. But it behooves us to notice this quote from James Chisholm in a fabulous book by Daniela Seif, who's an Oxford scholar, a survivor of trauma, and an anthropologist. But the quote here says, "From the perspective of evolution, neither the fast or the slow reproductive pattern is better than the other. Neither is biologically normal. What is normal and adaptive depends on the environment." But which would you rather be, an elephant or a rabbit? I mean, there's the sex, right? And then there's the slightly less stressed lifestyle. So ultimately, probably So that's life history as it shows up across species. But also, life history shows up within species too, and nowhere more than our species, because we are so developmentally plastic, so sort of receptive to what the environment, how the environment influences us. So the way I've shown it here is to contrast the old woman who lived in a shoe, who had so many children she didn't know what to do. She gave them some soup without any bread and scolded them soundly and sent them to bed. I've contrasted this lady with the Obama family. So you may be able to see there's 11 children in that shoe, 11 children to one adult. Clear that there aren't many resources. There wasn't enough bread to go round, and they are rather squished into that shoe. One imagines that they probably don't have a lot of agency or control in that environment to change it in the way that they might desire. But heading over to the Obama family, we have 2 adults and 2 children, and I imagine this family are very, very well resourced to buffer them against the uncertainties in life. I also imagine that these 2 young women have resources poured into them to help them get on in life, that they will be very competitive for school places, for university places, for jobs, for mates, and maybe the kinds of neighborhoods that they might want to live in. So here we see a lot of agency and power, and potentially in that, if you're an agent, then you have quite a reliable life so that you can do this thing called planning. If you live in an unpredictable world, you can't really plan because it's unpredictable. So your agency is thwarted. So just to sort of bring out the implicit trade-offs that I've really been talking about here, in harsh and unpredictable environments, evolution trades an uncertain future for what's available in the present. And the more harsh and unpredictable the environment is, the more evolution is likely to trade off these things. It's likely to trade off a slow, stable growth and development for earlier puberty, trade off cognitive flexibility for protective and defensive routines, conservation of resources for consumption of resources, and long-term goals where our agency is about planning for short-term gains to get us through the moment, because that's the immediacy effect. Our agency then pushes us into being impulsive, exploitative, and opportunistic, and this is adaptive in this unpredictable environment. Parenting effort is traded off in favor of mating effort. And lastly, health span and lifespan are traded off for reproductive effort. And these are the characteristics that we see of slow and fast life history. But a good question here is, how does this developing infant know it's in a harsh and unpredictable environment in time to initiate earlier puberty? Well, in a really parsimonious solution, and I do love finding parsimonious solutions in nature, it may be that the caregiving experiences, the relational experiences, the very same experiences from which an attachment pattern emerges or an infant becomes disorganized, whichever of those 2 it is, those are the same experiences that will calibrate our life history strategy, faster for more unpredictable and slower for perhaps more less harsh and more predictable life. So we can imagine then that parents who are living themselves in very harsh and unpredictable environments may mediate that harshness and unpredictability in the environment through their caregiving to their own infants. So you can see, rather like the rat mum that we started off with when I talked about epigenetics, parental behavior is becoming a proxy for the harshness and unpredictability in the environment. Parents can also buffer the environment, and they can also create the environment. So whatever the external environment is, parents, of course, may inadvertently create traumatizing environments, which are by themselves harsh and unpredictable, which would then shepherd someone towards a faster life strategy. So imagine if I'm an infant and I cry because something's wrong, something feels wrong inside of me, and I don't even know what it is. And I cry, and someone comes, and what they do when they come is they make it better. So I've had an experience of benevolent care. If I get that over and over again, that's predictable. And what also then happens is if I'm outside of what's homeostatically comfortable for me, then someone comes and they put it right. That's a regulating experience, and implicitly, of course, validating of that need, because that need has then been met and is attended to. And how great is it that when I cry, someone comes. I matter, I can bring someone to me, and I can get them to do for me what I can't do for myself. So if you think about that as a powerful experience, the anticipation that comes from that is that when I need someone, I can get someone to come to me and they will help. Taking that anticipation into the world is extraordinarily powerful. So you may recognize this little infant from the still face experiments. She points, she raises her hand, she claps, she smiles to get, she's got a massive repertoire of getting her mum's attention and response. Beautiful. Doesn't work because she's still faces them at that point in time, but it obviously works at other times. But of course, not all infants are that lucky. And so on this other side, we might have quite different experiences. So what if I'm crying because something feels wrong inside me? And sometimes someone comes and sometimes they don't come. And sometimes when they come, they make it better. And sometimes when they come, they hurt me. Then I've got a harsh experience and an unpredictable one. And if I cry and they come and then they make it worse, then that's an even more dysregulating experience. And so ultimately that's shaming. And of course, I don't have a sense of agency there because sometimes when I cry, this happens. And sometimes when I cry, something else happens. So I'm not linking my crying, my noise, what I'm putting into the world with a response that comes from the world. So in an unpredictability, that kind of the opportunity to get agency is sort of taken away from us. So that's how attachment links with life history theory. What we see is secure attachment associates with a slow life strategy and disorganizing experiences associate with a fast life strategy. I should just say though, when we do talk in evolutionary terms, we're talking populations. We're not talking every individual. So there are always going to be exceptions, but it's a population that it's studying. So this is another image from the paper that looks sort of down the lens of time, really. So remember we started with evolutionary time over which we've generated or evolved these neuroplastic mechanisms. And the purpose of those is that they allow the experiences we have in developmental time to specify us for our local conditions. So if we have harsh, unpredictable experiences, dysregulating relational experiences, and very little agency and power, what that's likely to do is accelerate our development. This isn't about choice. This is about being calibrated by these experiences. And it brings a present focus to us. What it's likely to do is make our resource acquisition more around being impulsive, opportunistic, taking risks, making the most of what's there at the time because you don't know if it's going to be available tomorrow. It's likely to speed up our reproductive efforts. And it's likely to put our time horizons in quite an immediate zone. So we're thinking about, the next hour, the next day, the next week, and that real future planning is sort of a bit not really on our map. And that's because we get these diminishing returns. The future is very uncertain, so you can't really rely on it delivering anything. And that leads eventually to this shorter lifespan and health span. But conversely, if we have experiences in our ecology that are benevolent and predictable, in our relational ecology that are regulating, and we get these experiences of power, this agency and control, there's no need to speed up development. We can make and maintain a future focus. We can plan. We can accrue resources in quite a reliable way. There's no need to speed up our reproductive decisions. We can wait until we've got the right partner and maybe the right job and we're living near the right school that we want the kids to go to. These kinds of decisions that do influence when we sort of take those breaks. And also our time horizons can be put more on a calendar than a kind of egg timer or a stopwatch. And we can pay our pension. We can keep fit. We can eat salads. We can do lots of these things that we know there are long-term gains because we're going to be around, likely to be around to collect the benefits. So these are the predictions then from life history theory. If your early environment is dangerous and unpredictable, there's a biological assumption that life may be cut short. It means that we're very likely to not want to delay gratification. You know, that thing about, do you want 2 marshmallows tomorrow or 1 today? I'll take the 1 today because I don't really believe you about the 2 tomorrow. You know, that makes sense in a fast environment and an unpredictable environment. We're likely to become impulsive, exploitative, to be desperately seeking regulation or distraction from anywhere. And it's likely to push us towards early puberty, lead to more and more sexually intense relationships, and potentially more children with mixed paternity and different fathers. Alternatively, if our early environment is safe and predictable, the tendency would be that there would be a biological assumption that life could be long, that gratification can be delayed, that we can become reflective and empathic, which are really good strategies if you're planning for the future and if you're in long-term relationships. We've got our experience of relationships is that they're quite reliable, so relational regulation is likely to be available. There's no need to speed up puberty. And there are fewer relationships with more trust. And the strategy here is fewer and more competitive offspring. So let's revisit the adverse childhood experience data through the life history lens. Imagine if you've had more than 4 categories of adversity in childhood. That probably means that you're growing up in a dangerous and unpredictable environment. And so those predictions that I just went through are likely to hold. So let's compare the predictions with the data points from the adverse childhood experience study. So the first prediction is that life may be cut short. And here we have 12 times the likelihood of dying by suicide, and more than 6 adverse childhood experiences reduces categories, I should say, reduces life expectancy by almost 20 years. And the second, third, and fourth predictions don't delay gratification, becoming impulsive and exploitative, desperately seeking regulation or distraction from anywhere. This is one that I very much identify with as someone who's recovering from addiction. What we see here is there's a 5 to 10 times more likely to be using drugs, injecting drugs, or becoming an alcoholic. And then the last two, earlier sexual development, more and more sexually intense relationships. Well, we've got 2.5 times the risk of getting a sexually transmitted disease and 3 times the likelihood of having more than 50 sexual partners over a lifetime. So it looks like what we were assuming to be pathology seems to be adapting to a fast life, going on a fast life strategy, which is adapting to this harsh and unpredictable environment. So here, where the authors have made social, emotional, and cognitive impairment the social, emotional, cognitive, and health effects associated with adverse childhood experiences may be transitioning from putative markers of dysfunction to integrated adaptations to ecology. This is Hertler's word from the 2022 paper. So what that suggests then is that adverse childhood experiences are not just risk factors for health and social outcomes, they are markers for our having been shepherded onto a fast life history strategy. So what might that mean? Well, it might mean that maybe we could consider moving away from charging individuals with taking responsibility for their choices and telling them to make better choices towards a more of a social justice informed perspective, where we are working to change the ecologies from which these adaptations, these fast life adaptations emerge. So the neuroplastic narrative has quite a strong theme of social justice running through it. I think it's great that people take as much responsibility as they can. I do, and I think it's an important thing. But I think sometimes we imagine that people can do more than they can. If you imagine that evolution's been at this a really, really long time, and it's shepherding our choices, we might need to take some notice of that. And because people feel very bad about, I think, not being able to make changes that they're asked to do. So secondly, Hertler asked this question: should medical and clinical practitioners, without reference to evolutionary trajectories and ecological context, reflexively pathologize patients with elevated adverse childhood experiences? And of course, I would say no. And I would prefer that we didn't quite have this, this pyramid quite as it looks here. I would prefer this one. But this is a pyramid where our neuroplastic mechanisms embed harsh and unpredictable experiences. We're shepherded towards a life history trajectory, successfully reproducing and then dying, but earlier. This is an adaptation to undesirable circumstances, to be contrasted with the very same mechanisms doing the very same thing. These are still adaptive mechanisms. They are still functioning to adapt us to our ecology. But what they're embedding is benevolent and predictable experiences, shepherding us onto a slow life trajectory, to successful reproduction and to death. So there's no difference in the mechanisms. There's no pathology here that I can see. The difference is that we're adapting to either undesirable or desirable circumstances. So what we have here is difference, We know from the neurodiversity movement that there's been a powerful request to stop pathologizing difference and instead take an appreciative stance. So this really is something that I'm jumping on the bandwagon with by introducing this term neuroecological diversity. I'm quite sure that none of you think there's anything wrong with these trees. I'm also quite sure you don't think they've got a genetic vulnerability to wind or that they're attention seeking. Or that this tree perhaps has a narcissistic personality disorder. Or that this one might have OCD with perfectionist traits. Or this one have body dysmorphia. Or lastly, and my favourite, that this one has a disorder for hoarding. It's really clear to us with trees, because trees don't move in their environment. It's really clear to us what the ways in which their environment has impacted them. And so really a strong message from this narrative is for us to make generous assumptions when we see people in behaving particular ways, to imagine into the ecology that they've come from and the ways that they have adapted to that. They've adapted in order to survive and reproduce as best they can. And so it just changes our stance slightly and moves us away from that pathologizing medical model and towards this more appreciative stance of the neuroplastic narrative. So just to pop up here, this is neuroecological diversity sort of featured in the middle. I think that brains become slow adapted or fast adapted, and there could be a very big difference between those brains. So really, you might need to be withholding on these judgments of less than or ill or so on, just to be sort of mindful of it. And now, just to summarize, if you've got 5 more minutes, I'm not sure how I'm doing for time. Okay. Oh, good. What I would like to introduce you to is Baba Brinkman, who is a New York rap artist and a colleague friend of mine, who is married to a neuroscientist, and he's a polymath. He raps about all sorts of things. He's a great source of information that's very, very easy to learn. So I do encourage you to Google him. But I asked him to do me a rap, the Neuroplastic Wrap, to summarize this paper, and he has done so. So let's just watch Better Days.
I learned to expect the worst as a child, trying to survive as a child. But now it's time to relearn. Now the better days have arrived.
Girl, you had a tough life. I see you dealing with it. Invisible, adverse childhood experiences. A backwards facing handful of aces trapped in the basement. Slaps instead of embraces. Anticipation. Drama begets drama. A biological expectation of trauma, not karma. Just an internal thermostat that tracks danger. Calibrated out our internal working model of what to expect from the people you should look to for love and respect. Family first. But when it doesn't protect, your links begin to form between trust and regret. Invisible girl living in the midst of a swirl of difficulties in an unpredictable world with limited resources. You can't choose the genes you were born with, and you can't choose the scenes your first impressions were formed in. External forces shriveled the sense of agency in your cortex. Short fuse cut short by a few shortages. Can't see the future or how to transform it.
I turn my world brighter. Now the better days have arrived. Oh, I turn my world brighter. Now the better days have arrived.
Girl, you got set up. Fast life history. Doctors bring in pills to fix chemistry and talk about mental illnesses and disease. When they told you that you're sick, what a relief. Diagnosed with multiple anxiety disorders, depression, personality on the border, bricks and mortar laid in torrential rain, landscaping terrain, deprivation and pain, quick to rage. But that trigger isn't a choice. Did it come from today or the subconscious void, or something from an ancestral humanoid? Either way, flooded with glucocorticoids, and that's okay. By design, fight or flight, evolutionarily adaptive. It's quite alright, I'm not here to choose what's wrong from a menu. I'm just here to validate all that you've been through. You face challenges known to do damage. It's no shame behaving like a wounded mammal if you are one. And where predators thrive, the paranoid rabbit is the one that survives, and that's fine. But when predators evade, hypervigilance makes nervous systems degrade. So let's diffuse the bomb with a code and set the frame for post-traumatic growth.
I turn my provider. Now the better days have arrived. I turn my provider. Now the better days have arrived.
Girl, you're so full of epigenetic markers. The sins of the fathers visited on the daughters. Intergenerational trauma, perpetuated expectations, setting DNA methylated. But the cycle is limited. You get to break it every generation. That effect gets abated. Forget the sins of the great grandmas. It only lasts a couple of generations in mammals, so you can take action. Girl, you're so elastic, no concrete statue. Your neuroplastic memory is so dynamic. Many benefits. Each new experience amps neurogenesis. I know you got shamed a lot, reviled and hated, and those are the pathways that got myelinated. So rewire it, baby, try to get better. It's neurons that fire together, wired together from a safe place to chaotic adversity, generating neuro-ecological diversity, adaptive imperatives, wrapped in experience. You can share this with your therapist.
Now it's time to realize. Now the better days have arrived. Oh, I turn my lighter. Now the better days have arrived.
There we go, folks. That's a reference to the article, but I send it around. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Haley. That was a really engaging